Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the next in our series of the Clinical Incubator the Incubator in Clinical Education Research, and we're running this series on how to get started in clinical education research. So if that's not what you thought you'd signed up for, then absolutely fine to disappear off now, but we're hoping that most of you will stay. We're going to start on time, just because we know that some people may be working clinically or doing other things, and so that therefore we want to just honour your time, but we know that others may join us over the next 45 minutes or so. But yeah, very, very warm welcome. The title of what we're looking at this webinar is looking at our research questions, how to get our ideas from a big idea into actually a set research question. And just to warn you that quite a lot of the session today will be in some small groups, because this is a sort of topic that's difficult to read a textbook on, or even a research article on. It is very much hearing from others, finding out the best way to do it. So there will be quite a lot of discussions in small groups. We'd suggest that when there's a few slides that we're going to be showing, and when we're showing the slides, absolutely fine just to keep your videos off. But when we go into the small groups, we just ask if people can put their cameras on, because then everyone can see them, and then you can find out who else you're chatting to. We won't go around introductions all together now, but if people could just in the chat box maybe just pop up their name and who you are and where you work. Sometimes people have kind of formed connections and relationships, or even people from the same institution didn't realize they were here. So that's always helpful. And then when we get into the first small group session, there'll be a chance just to say who you are when you're chatting to people. As I said, this is the third of the monthly webinars that we're running. The first two, which were an introduction to clinical education research and then how to start a literature review. The webinars are up on our website. And at the end of today, if you don't have the link to our website and to registration of these sessions, then we'll put up the website at the end of today. This will be recorded as well, like the others. And then the next session is on the 17th of January, where we're going to be starting to look at methodologies. So that's the plan. And the plan over the year is to cover really the basics on how to get started in education research. I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning of today's session. Apologies. My name is Hugh Alberti. I am Professor of General Practice Education at Newcastle University. And today's session, very pleased to welcome Lily Lamb, who's a GP and is doing a PhD funded by the NIHR on role modelling, and she's going to be leading today's session. So I'll pass over to Lily and look forward to some interesting discussions.
Thank you, Hugh. I'm just going to share my screen. Can everyone see that okay? Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, so yeah, thank you for inviting me to help deliver this session on coming up with an idea and writing a research question. It's great to see so many of you here, and thank you for making the time to come along today. So these are our aims. So we're hoping that by the end of this session, you'll have a bit more of an understanding of the process of turning an idea into a research question. We're intending to share our own or some of our own journeys from idea to research question. We're going to cover some of our top tips for writing research question. And then giving, as Hugh said, that this is going to be mainly about small group discussions. So giving you the opportunity to consider your own research ideas, aims, and potential questions is the plan. So, sorry, my Zoom window's in the wrong place and I can't advance my slides. Bear with me. Sorry, technical issues. And going. Okay, so here are some quotes that we thought were particularly pertinent. to this area of research. So really, this talk is focused on clinical education research rather than more conventional biomedical models of research. But these quotes we thought were quite good. So good questions do not necessarily produce good research, but poorly conceived or constructed questions will likely create problems that affect all subsequent stages of the study. So they are important. So that's from McGee, 2008. And from Creswell, our questions change during the process of research to reflect an increased understanding of the problem. So qualitative research, by its nature, is often quite iterative, and the questions that you start out with aren't necessarily the questions that you end up answering in your research. And I've experienced this firsthand, as I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So Hugh and I thought at the start of the session we would share our own ideas and how we ended up in doing research in this area. So as Hugh mentioned, I'm a GP and I'm also now an NIHR doctoral fellow. So I'm in the first year of my PhD, funded by the NIHR. But I qualified as a GP in early 2015, having had a prolonged training program. I had 2 babies during training, but during that time I also did the certificate in medical education, did some teaching and really enjoyed it. So I took a 7-session post as a GP in 2015, got involved with teaching 3rd-year students and really enjoyed it, but quickly started to see the challenges in being a mum, being a clinician and being an educator, and started to think, this is really quite difficult, consistently providing a positive role model to the students that I encounter, to my work colleagues, being a good GP for the patients I encounter, all felt really quite challenging. And the following year, two pivotal reports were produced that really caught my attention. So Valerie Wass's report for the Medical Schools Council and Health Education England, which was called By Choice, Not by Chance, and it was all about supporting medical students towards careers in general practice. And then the Royal College of GPs produced their report, Destination GP, again about supporting students towards these careers. And it really stood out to me how important role models were in medical students making their decisions to become a GP, but not just in making those career decisions, but in shaping their perception, shaping their professional identity. And it really made me think, reflecting on my own experience, what can be done about this? So we've identified that role models are really important, but how do we translate that into positive action so that medical students will not only choose a career as a general practitioner, but that their perceptions will be changed? And one of the other things that really stood out to me was that medical students didn't associate general practice with intellectual challenge. Only 3%, in fact, in the Royal College's report said that they saw general practice as intellectually challenging, and that there was a real lack of academic role models in general practice, particularly in senior positions within educational institutions. So all of that kind of came together to make me think, what can we do about this? And then I had a very serendipitous meeting with Hugh at one of the GP teacher events where we talked about, my thoughts on wanting to perhaps do something in this sphere and wanting to do the Masters in Medical Education as well. And that led to an application for an NIHR funded post, which is called an in-practice fellowship, which I was successful in obtaining. And that took me down a path of doing a systematic review, doing the Masters in Medical Education, where I developed those skills to really think about what my research questions were and how I might start to answer them. So I did some qualitative research using something called interpretative phenomenological analysis, which I still struggle to say, exploring the experience of those who had chosen a career as a GP and how role models had influenced them. And I did a systematic review exploring the impact of role modeling in general practice. And that has led on to this PhD fellowship, which I'm doing now, which I'll tell you a bit more about later. But really, just to make the point that I think often in research, good ideas come from a place of perhaps frustration, perhaps seeing a need, perhaps seeing something that you're passionate about and want to make a difference in. And for me, that's really helped me on my journey, doing something that I care about, doing something that I see a need to make a difference in. over to you, Hugh. What was your idea?
Thanks, Lily. Well, I thought I would talk about an idea that was quite a while ago, but a very different topic. So this was very much when I was a teacher, not a researcher. So in a previous role as, I think I was probably a GP lecturer at the time, but predominantly just doing teaching. But I'd done the diploma in medical education and just was wondering about whether to do a master's or not. Couldn't really be bothered, to be honest. But then I discovered at Newcastle that we were about to start a campus in Malaysia. So Newcastle University now has a medical campus in Malaysia, which started about over 10 years ago. I wasn't involved at the time, either the decision to do so or how it was implemented. But it did immediately raise some questions in my mind. One of the modules I'd done in the diploma, I'd chosen to look at globalization of medical education. And there were calls, I think there still are some calls that medical education, undergraduate medical education should be standardized internationally. So that if one graduate from one country moves to another country, then you know that they've studied all the same thing. And this may well be true in other areas of clinical education and in nursing or veterinary or even dentistry. But there are obviously lots of questions about that. So there's a whole question of cultural imperialism. There's a whole question of contextualization. So my first thought was, how would that work, and what about the questions around that? And then actually chose then to do the masters, not because I necessarily wanted the qualification at the time, although it's been very useful since, but just because I started with a question thinking, how is that going to work, and would that work? And so I then, the advantage of doing a research project within the master's context was that I had some great supervisors, and people really helped to channel. Apologies if you hear the dogs in the background, but people can really help you to define the research questions. And I just remember the journey from my idea of how would that work to implement a Western medical curricula into an Eastern culture, from that big, massive question. And the main help that the supervisors gave me was just reminding me that small is beautiful, and to narrow down my area of interest till I actually had a feasible but also useful research question, aim, and objective, which I will share a bit later on. Back to you, Lily.
Thanks, Hugh. So I think that's such a good point about doing something that's small and manageable and not trying to, take on anything too big, is really important, particularly in your first project. Okay, so what we'd like to do now is to split you into some small groups. We're delighted that we've got 25 or 24 of you here, which is fantastic, the week before Christmas. So I think we'll aim for perhaps groups of 8, 3 groups of 8, Lee, and then Hugh and I will facilitate. There'll potentially be one group which won't have a facilitator, but what we're hoping to do, let me just pop onto the next slide, is to really get you to, so this first group is going to be 10 minutes, and you'll get a kind of warning when there's I think a minute left in the group, and what we'd really like you to do is firstly introduce yourselves, so what your role is, and then share your own research ideas and areas of interest in that group, if that's okay. Thanks, Lee, and thanks for everyone for contributing to the discussions. As I said, we're not going to kind of go through all the ideas that were discussed, but in our group we had some really interesting kind of discussion about ideas. There's a real diversity of roles and stages in the research journey within our group, but I think key themes that came out were everyone was wanting to explore areas where they had seen a need. So they'd worked in the system and seen a need, and they had a desire to fix a problem, I guess, or do something about a problem that was occurring. And kind of supervisors came out as really important in helping turn that idea into a manageable project. So Hugh, were there any key themes that came out of your group?
Very similar, actually, Lily. So yeah, absolutely. The areas of interest predominantly came out of people's experience themselves of something that either worked well or more commonly didn't particularly work well. There was a bit of discussion of supervisors, but sometimes lack of good supervision to be able to do, I guess, quality research. And also just a point raised when someone had done some qualitative work and ended up with more questions than answers at the end of the project, and therefore wants to do more work in the area to start answering those questions. So I thought that was a really helpful and not uncommon point.
Absolutely. It's not a kind of short stint that you tend to do in these areas, is that you don't get the answers within a couple of years. Often it just generates more questions and a desire to do more work. So that's great. And I think there was a third group. Would anyone like to feedback from the third group?
I'll say something. I think everyone else has gone quiet.
Thank you, Sophie.
Sorry, apologies in advance if my dogs bark as well. Yeah, we had a really diverse group too, and we had lots of different discussions from there's a few people doing masters, I believe, or in the process of doing them, and thinking about their projects. One of them was looking at like peer assisted or near peer teaching and the potential use of it in a dissection room and anatomy, which sounded like a really interesting thing. One of the comments, or one of the running themes, I think, was that we're finding it quite difficult to sort of focus in on a topic that is achievable. For example, I started talking about how I'd like to change the culture of how people view medical education and teacher identity, and something like that is too big. And I struggle with having lots of different ideas and actually sticking to one of them. I'm quite interested in AI and how that could be used in med ed. The potential of eye tracking, because I'm a radiologist. But yeah, we had quite a few different opinions, but I think it sounded like we were all sort of at the beginning, although I think there's some technical difficulties. We couldn't hear a couple of people, unfortunately. I'm not sure if I've probably missed a huge amount. If anyone else wants to chip in from my group.
I think that sounds like a brilliant summary, Sophie. Thank you for being brave and coming forward. And yeah, wonderful to hear the rich discussions and similar challenges. And sometimes sharing challenges is really helpful in navigating a way forward. And I think often in research, you can feel like you're the only one facing these things, but actually it can be so helpful to hear others have the same challenges. Brilliant. Okay, I will go back to sharing my screen. Okay, so these points are borrowed from a previous Incubator webinar, which was run by Megan Brown and Brian Burford last year, I think it was. It's called Mastering the Basics, and basically to kind of help you think about aims and research questions. So an aim is typically quite broad, and research questions are more precise. So the aim is usually to verb a phenomenon. So, for example, my aim for my in practice fellowship and my master's was to understand the impact of role modelling in undergraduate medical education. So really quite broad. Whereas the research questions are the questions your research sets out to answer. And that sounds obvious, but it is really important to keep that in the back of your mind, because all the way through the process, you should be thinking, is this research going to answer this question? And if not, then you're probably on the wrong track. Thinking about theory from the start is important. It provides a framework for describing and understanding the topic and findings. And again, I found that really hard to get my head around when I started out on this journey. It was like, well, I can see the problem. I want to do something about it. I just want to crack on and, do my review and do my interviews and find out some answers. But actually, as I spent more time immersed in that environment, I started to appreciate that actually I already had some theory in mind. I had some kind of frameworks, some level of understanding that was, I suppose, shaping my thoughts in this area. But as I read around, it was really quite interesting to see all the stuff that was out there around role modeling. So things like social learning theory, socialization theory, the motivational theory of role modeling are all really relevant. And again, that just particularly with the writing up process, it really helped to shape my thoughts. So nobody expects you to know what the relevant theories are. Talking to supervisors is very important because often they will know, some key theories and point you in the right direction for you to go and read. So I guess the other point about that is to make time for reading. Don't just expect to get on and make time to read. And then don't think about the methodology and methods too soon, because the relevant methodology and methods will depend on your research paradigm that you're approaching from and what kind of questions you're wanting to answer. So for example, if you are wanting to say, does a teaching intervention work? And that's kind of potentially a yes or no answer, and a much more positivist type of research question, that's going to change the method you use, and you'd be probably more likely to use quantitative methods and do statistical analyses. Whereas if you want to understand why something is happening due to an intervention in medical education, you're going to be much more likely to adopt a qualitative approach. So really, really important to nail down what your aim is, and what your initial research questions are anyway before thinking about methods. So these are our top tips for writing research questions, and these are taken from a really helpful paper in the Clinical Teacher from Karen Mattick and team. So as we've said already, don't expect the first question to be the final question or questions. Try and find an important topic where your research can provide new insights. Where is the knowledge gap? And really care about that. Find something that you care about. Don't do research for research's sake. Do it because you're passionate about it and want to make a difference. I think a really important lesson that I've learned is the importance of not only, looking for published articles, but also talking to people. So talking to key stakeholders about what the important and unanswered questions are in this area. So for me, that meant meeting up with medical students, meeting up with GP educators, meeting up with some senior people for the Royal College of GPs and saying to them, this is my thought, what do you think? And they can provide a really interesting perspective, which can help work out what the research questions are. Good research questions are narrow and specific, but they don't always start out that way, and that's okay. And don't expect to make huge leaps in knowledge through your research. And make sure the questions are manageable and achievable in the time you have. And chances are what is manageable will be less than perhaps you initially think. As I said earlier, what kind of question, when, what, how, and why will determine the methods that you use. And yes, make the point again, talk to your supervisors, listen to their advice, and refine your questions with their input. So this is where I'm at now. So as I said, I've transitioned on from an in-practice fellowship to a doctoral fellowship. So I'm funded by NIHR to do a PhD as well as continuing as a general practitioner. So I do 3 sessions a week of general practice and 5 sessions of research. So it's a 6-year PhD, which feels like a lovely long time, but probably will fly by. But in that time, I'm hoping to answer these questions. So my title now is this: supporting medical students towards careers in general practice through maximising the potential of role modelling, a realist review of what works for whom and in what circumstances. So my in-practice fellowship allowed me to identify the impact role modeling was having on undergraduates, and it was having quite a important impact, as I said before, on careers, but also perceptions, and also shaping the identity, the professional identity of undergraduates. So now I want to understand how we can utilize role modeling to support medical students towards careers in general practice. And because, so some of you probably won't have heard of realist research before, but realist research is all about trying to understand complex interventions and trying to work out what works for whom, why, and in what circumstances. So it's not saying, does something work? It's trying to get that kind of level of detail and recognizing that, you know, perhaps a GP teaching in a surgery where there's really high levels of deprivation and a really complex group of patients, they might be quite a different role model to someone who's in a more protected and well-staffed environment. So I'm hoping that my research will be able to look at some of the granularity around the different types of settings that we're teaching our undergraduates in. So because of the realist approach, my research questions are very much framed in realist language, which is all looking at key context, mechanisms, and outcomes. And I won't go into detail on that today. But you can see there that my research questions are quite specific, and I'm going to answer these through doing a realist review and realist evaluation, and then some co-production work. Okay, on to Hugh.
So back to part 2 of my story. So if you remember from part 1, Newcastle University, actually on the invite of the Malaysian Medical Council, introduced our curriculum into a medical school in Johor in Malaysia. So I was left with these questions: how would that work? How do we avoid cultural imperialism, etc.? So from those very big, lofty kind of questions, a bit like Sophie was just sharing, big topics, I want to solve the whole of this. I had to focus. So firstly, I thought, well, which aspects of the curriculum do I think will be particularly tricky? And it was communication skills training, thinking surely communication is very much culturally derived. So let's focus on the communication curricula. Even that was too big. So then actually had to narrow it down to just one aspect of the communication skills curriculum, which was the information gathering component or module. And so from my big, lofty, huge questions, it then went down to looking at one very small focused area, which I then tried to look at through various means, did some interviews, some focus groups, and some observation. But I remember writing the questions, and I annoyingly now do this to my supervisees, but almost every word of the aim, which is in bold here, and the 2 research questions, I almost agonized over. And there's a term which I can never pronounce properly, but it's operationalization. So operationalizing every word. So what did I mean by perceived? What do I mean by cultural? What do I mean by factors? Because they can all be used or translated into slightly different ways. And so it really is thinking about every single word that you use. But I'm glad I did, because then by focusing on, this was a master's, so this had to be done in a relatively short amount of time. But I did actually then get some answers which haven't changed the world. I suppose that's the other thing, is realizing your research isn't going to change the world, but hopefully along with other bits of research and other people doing similar work, it will help gain a better understanding of what's going on, and therefore improve medical education in the future.
Thanks, Hugh. That's great. I think that idea of what does each word in your research question really mean? How am I going to make sure that I deliver on that is important. And I've kind of gone on the same journey of many iterations of my research questions to framing them in ways that I'm really, planning to answer in the research. So we're going to go back into small groups for the next 10 minutes. What we'd like you to do is chat about your potential research aim and initial research question. I appreciate you we're all at different stages in the journey, but just have a go. There's no wrong answers at this stage. And then we'll come back into the group and just discuss main themes again. So we had, again, a really rich discussion in our group. We were back in the same group, which was super helpful because we could talk about how we've turned our thoughts into research questions. And I think the key thing that stood out for me was really the framing of the research question and how it translated into an appropriate methodology. So the people who were wanting to know, is this an effective teaching tool, were then planning to use perhaps more quantitative methods, though some qualitative interviews. But really it was about answering a question, yes or no, is this effective? Whereas those who were seeking to explore and to understand were planning on using more qualitative methods like methodology like phenomenology. So that was the thing that stood out for me. Hugh, what were the themes?
Yeah, unfortunately, I know we're limited for time, so we didn't have enough time really to explore things in detail. But I guess we're talking a little bit together and just sharing some thoughts about when you're asking students perceptions on a particular aspect of teaching, and whether they can remember what's happened, whether it's related to the teaching itself or to the fact that they're just experiencing life at medical school and everything else, and whether you can then put any changes that they've experienced down to our amazing curricula and things that we've put into place, or actually whether these things would have happened as they've grown and developed. Anyway, and I was just highlighting at the end, I think just how useful it is to be able to talk through ideas with other people, whether it's a formal supervisor or informal colleagues, and just encouraging people to do that, because it really helps to refine your own mind and thinking.
Absolutely. Thanks, Hugh. Okay, and does anyone from the third group want to share any themes that came out?
Don't make me do it again.
Excellent volunteering.
You were so good last time. Thank you.
We spoke about quite a few bits, but again, we didn't go actually into a huge amount of detail. I think because of both, well, we're all as a group at those real basic initial stages. One was talking about how he is looking into the fact that a lot of their practices don't appear to be evidence-based, and that some of the things that they do are based purely on like one centre's findings. So he wants to look at how he can do a few different types of research projects to change that so that they have evidence-based guidelines and that they can be shared with other trusts. I think that's a summary. I hope that's right. And then Philippa, we were talking about how she's at the beginning of her sort of research journey, and that she's finding it a bit difficult because in terms of supports, and I think she's wanting to look at maybe why there isn't as much research led by radiographers in particular, and whether that is due to lack of support or education. So there's a few different questions there. And yeah, I think it's because we're all so early, we don't have a specific yes or no question. I think we're still at that topic area and we're trying to then focus down. But I was mentioning how I'd been to DMEC and how listening to one speaker kind of completely changed then my idea of what it was that I wanted to focus my research on. And that if you network and you meet more people, especially if they're in different areas, like it was Vivian Ming, who's a scientist, so she's not a medic, and that was actually really, really eye-opening. I think the more people that you can talk to about your research, or the more things that you can attend, the greater focus you're going to have on what it is that you actually want to answer, and actually whether it's going to be beneficial or not.
I think that is such a good point, Sophie, and thank you for summarising for your group. Really appreciate it. But yeah, absolutely. It's not just about living in a clinical environment and seeing the problems and reading. It's really about your network as well, and that's how you find supervisors, that's how you talk ideas through, that's people suggest different perspectives. So yeah, I really encourage everyone to get to conferences if you can. I appreciate that can be difficult, but also joining the Incubator. There's a fantastic network of people who are interested in clinical education research at all stages of training, and really good support infrastructure there. So please do pass on your details to Lee. And we also have a database, don't we, of people who can potentially supervise and mentor. So if you're struggling to find anyone, there's that resource as well. So I think that's time up. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and have a wonderful Christmas.